All living things depend on genes, which hold the information to build and maintain an organism's cells and pass genetic traits to offspring. Half of your genes come from your mother and half from your father, which of course means that a quarter of your genes come from each of your grandparents, and so on and so on. Genes can determine everything from eye color to the intensity of a person's political convictions. We are who we are because of genetic determinations like these, in combination with our life experiences, which in turn are shaped by the family, community, and culture in which we were raised. To fully understand Team Williams, then, we must travel back in time and acquaint ourselves with their ancestors. The family lines for Team Williams are varied, and some of them can be traced as far back as 400 years ago. Many of those ancestors came to the United States in the middle and late 19th century from Europe and Scandinavia as immigrants and recent converts to the newly formed Mormon Church. Founded in upstate New York in 1830 by the charismatic leader Joseph Smith, the Mormon Church expanded rapidly. In the 1830s and most of the 1840s, Mormons in the U.S. moved from place to place, including Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois. They kept moving in part because they faced persecution nearly everywhere they went. The persecution that faced the early Mormons bound them closer together, creating a core of strong believers while sifting out those who were less than wholly committed. Team Williams' great-great-great-great-paternal grandfather, William Champlin, was an early Mormon who faced such persecution. In the mid-1830s, William and a number of other Mormons established the small village of Haun's Mill in Missouri. Missouri was becoming an increasingly hostile place for Mormons, in part because of Mormon opposition to slavery. On October 30th, 1838, a mob of over 200 Missourians rode into Haun's Mill. The Mormon women and children hid in the nearby woods, but the men stayed behind to protect the village. Many of them took cover in a blacksmith shop, an act that ended in tragedy. The logs of the shop had large gaps between them, and the militia simply aimed their guns, firing between the logs, killing nearly every man inside. This was known as the Haun's Mill Massacre, and only 2 men survived. One of these was Team Williams' ancestor, William Champlin, who stayed alive by pretending that he was dead, even as one of the militiamen dragged him around the blacksmith shop trying to remove his boots. The strife between the Mormon and non-Mormon settlers peaked in 1844 when an angry mob surrounded the jail where Joseph Smith was locked up on the 2nd floor. Joseph was shot and fell from the jail's window to the ground. After the assassination of Smith, a new leader arose, Brigham Young. Believing enough was enough, Young led the Mormons west into wild and largely unsettled lands. From Nauvoo, they crossed the plains and rocky passes of the west, arriving at last in the Salt Lake Valley of the Utah Territory. In the decades that followed, streams of Mormon settlers began crossing the western plains for the new home in Utah. The way there was often brutally difficult, especially for the handcart pioneers. One of these handcart pioneers was Team Williams' maternal great-great-great-grandfather, Richard Godfrey. Born in England in 1835, he converted to Mormonism and in 1856 sailed to America as part of the Willey Company, a group of 700 European Mormons named after its captain, James Willey. After arriving in Winter Quarters, Iowa, they set out for the long westward trek. While the first Mormon pioneers crossed the plains with oxen-drawn covered wagons, the handcart pioneers were mostly poor European immigrants who could only afford to travel by foot, carrying their belongings over 1,000 miles in what were essentially large wheelbarrows. The Willey Company's westward trek began too late in the year, and by the time they reached the highlands of Wyoming, winter was setting in, and food was running out. Richard and many others, their shoes worn through, left footprints of blood in the snow. As they approached the Continental Divide, a blizzard struck. Unable to continue through the piling snow, they sent scouts towards Salt Lake. For well over a week they waited, starving and freezing. Finally, rescuers arrived from Salt Lake City with supplies and wagons. Most of the people in the company were too weak to cross the Sweetwater River and had to be carried through flowing chunks of ice. The Willie Handcart Company lost around 1/4 of its members in all to starvation, exhaustion, or hypothermia. Richard Godfrey survived, but walked with a cane for the rest of his life. On the paternal side, Team Williams' great-great-great-grandparents made a similar journey. William Tweed Wright and his wife, Maria Brown Wright, were born in Ireland and sailed for America in 1856, where they joined the first handcart company. Maria Brown Wright, who walked over 1,000 miles from Iowa to Salt Lake City, never mentioned in her journal that during the entire 2-month journey across the plains, she was in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. Eventually, William and Maria were among the first white settlers of Idaho. William eventually left the Mormon church over a dispute with the local bishop. Most Mormons swore off tobacco, but no longer a member of the church, William Tweed Wright began smoking a pipe. One of William and Maria's children was William Brown Wright, who married Rosanna Ellis. One of their sons was Leroy Brown Wright. He was a man of few words, but many notes, who could play most any instrument he picked up. Leroy married a lively and gregarious woman, Myrtle Neely, who Matthew remembers as Great-Grandma Wright. One of Leroy and Myrtle's children was Gwen Wright, Team Williams' paternal grandmother. Gwen Wright was an intelligent young woman who loved to read and enjoyed riding around town with her high school friends. In the 1940s, she met Melvin Williams, Team Williams' paternal grandfather. Melvin's father was George Williams. George was born in 1863 and grew up in this house in Littledean, England, near the border of Wales. George eventually made his way to the United States and was one of the first settlers of Pocatello, Idaho. George worked a variety of jobs. He owned this general store for years and was the mayor of Pocatello for a time. After his first wife tragically drowned in a river, George married Team Williams' great-grandmother, a Swedish immigrant named Maria Botilda Hockman, known to everyone as Tilda. George apparently was a hard man to deal with, and in the late 1930s, Tilda divorced him. After that, George spent much of his last 5 years unsuccessfully prospecting for precious metals in the mountains around Pocatello. One of George and Maria's children was Melvin, who everyone called Mel. Mel met and married Gwen Wright 4 years before World War II began. Mel put his livelihood as a mechanic on hold to serve with the United States Army in the 91st Infantry Division, based in North Africa and Italy. Mel was a quiet man who loved the outdoors. He would take the family camping in this car. The young Gordon, Team Williams' father, would sleep in the attached camper, imagining that it was a covered wagon, just like the ones his pioneer ancestors used. In the mid-1950s, Mel and Gwen built their dream home on a hillside overlooking Pocatello. For Matthew, Drew, Kelly, and Kim, this house carries some of their fondest memories. What was your absolute favorite thing about Grandma Williams' house?
Definitely the location where it was at. It felt like almost a private retreat or cabin. In the wintertime, there was a lot of snow, so we could do cool snow tunnels and luges.
Ah, the luge runs.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a lot of good memories of the time I stayed with Grandma on my own. She brought paper dolls and I put those together and she would sit there and knit. And we just kind of had our quiet moments together.
Gwen was an accomplished quilter and a lover of cats. Team Williams fondly remembers Morris, a fixture on Grandma's living room couch. Mel loved gardening and had a beautiful garden. Appropriately enough, it was there that he passed away in 1988. Gwen lived for 14 years more, passing away in 2002. Of their 3 children, Gordon Williams was the middle child and the only boy, born in 1948. Gordon inherited his father's love of the outdoors. He also loved to draw. Both of these traits were in turn passed on to his own children. Gordon also loved cars and fondly remembers the 1959 Impala Coupe he acquired in high school. Although Mel and Gwen were not active members of the Mormon Church, Gordon became friends with some Mormons as a young man and converted. At the age of 21, he went on a mission for the Mormon Church in New Zealand, where he taught among the descendants of the British settlers and amongst the native Maori people. After returning to the U.S., Gordon got a job designing and surveying roads for the U.S. Forest Service and began studying landscape architecture at Utah State University. This is where he met Carol Johnson. And now, we rewind the clock again to see Team Williams' maternal side. We already met Richard Godfrey. His daughter was Agnes May Godfrey, who met and married Joseph Martin Larson. Their daughter, Ella Loretta, was born in 1903. She married Byron Lee Loosley. One of his 8 children was Arlene Loosley, Team Williams' maternal grandmother. Born in 1926, Arlene grew up primarily in northern Utah, where she met and married Team Williams' grandfather, Palmer Earl Johnson, known to everyone as Earl. Most of Earl's ancestors were from Norway. His great-grandfather, Peder Andreas Hartvigsson, was born in 1843 in Tromsø, Norway, a tiny fishing town in the northernmost region of Norway. Despite being a Mormon, Peder was apparently an enthusiastic drinker, and at 6'2" and 320 pounds, had no problems holding his liquor. One of Peder's many children was Eliza Sophia Hartvigsson. Eliza met and married a Norwegian man, Paul Andreas Johnson. One of their many children was Paul Bertina Johnson. Paul married Bertha Rollins, and one of their many children was Team Williams' grandfather, Earl. Earl was a true Western cowboy, with a wry sense of humor and a bit of a wild streak. As a young man, he hopped trains. One night, while riding the rails, the railroad guards found him and some other rail riders. Earl escaped by climbing to the roof of one of the rail cars, holding on for dear life as the train started back up. Later, Earl met and married Arlene and began working odd jobs until called to serve in World War II. Once he returned home, he and Arlene started a family, eventually having 7 children. The oldest of these was Carol, Team Williams' mother. From kindergarten to the 4th grade, Carol and her family lived in various towns in the state of Washington. When Carol was in the 4th grade, her family moved back to Utah. Carol fondly remembers the time as a teenager, around 1962, when the family went to Disneyland and the beaches of Southern California. In the late 60s, Carol served as a missionary in Uruguay and Paraguay, where she became fluent in Spanish. Carol was awestruck at the sight of bustling streets and hair-raising taxi rides of Montevideo, Uruguay, the largest town she had been to up to that time. Carol returned from her mission after 2 years in South America, and in the early 1970s, she met Gordon at Utah State University. They married, and in 1974, had their first child, Matthew. And that brings us back to our story. With Kimberly and Kelly at about 5 feet 10 inches and Drew and Matthew reaching about 6'4", Team Williams plainly carries the blood of the Vikings in their veins. But they also inherited from their forebears many other characteristics: a love for camping and the mountains and wide open spaces of the western United States, an appreciation of education, of music, of art, and of faraway places and other cultures. They have their parents to thank for this, and grandparents, and everyone that came before them.